Welcome, Marie-Claude.
Hi, thanks, Catherine. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Just to introduce myself, I'm Marie-Claude Graton, and I'm the founder and director of Espace Idée, and we are a small social enterprise that focuses on helping nonprofits find solutions in philanthropy and communications. And we've really chosen to work specifically with smaller nonprofits. So the way we do that is really through our training. We do in-person training, we do webinars like this one this morning, and we also do consulting and coaching. I've been working in the sector, the nonprofit sector, for more than 20 years now. And when I first started, my very first role was actually research and proposal writing. So I did this for a few years. This was more than 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago. So things have changed a little bit now. They've evolved because of the technology. But, you know, the basics are still there. And so that's what I'm hoping to cover today, is some of the basics, you know, when you're creating and sending out some of these funding proposals, just to give you, just to help you out a little bit and hopefully save some time and increase your chances of getting funded. So I'm going to get started. Businesses, corporations, and foundations, we all know it's crazy the quantity of funding requests and proposals that they receive, okay? So if you just look at RBC, so this is the bank, RBC, they receive 30,000 funding requests per year. So that's the equivalent of 10 requests every hour of every business day. So that's crazy. And I mean, this is just RBC, but I think we can pretty much assume that this is the case for the majority of large corporations. Now, some of these large corporations, they've actually automated their funding systems. So what happens is you go online and you fill out an online giving form. And the reason a lot of funders do that is just to automate, to help them out and simplify because of the quantity of requests that they're getting. However, not everybody, not all enterprises, foundations, businesses are able to automate. So some of them, it's still a human being going through all of these funding requests. So you can just imagine, you know, what kind of task that is. It's just huge. It's so time consuming. So of course, for that reason, not everybody can get funded. So before I give you some tricks in increasing your chances of getting funded, I just want to cover what are some reasons, or what are some reasons why organizations are not getting funded? Okay, so why are funding requests denied? Well, the first one has to do with the funding criteria. So organizations sometimes don't do their research to target the right funders. They don't bother looking at what funding criteria, what are the things that this particular foundation or business, what do they fund? So that's a big one. And the funding criteria, I would tell you, in most cases, for most businesses and most foundations, it's usually pretty easy to find, and most of them usually have some form of criteria. Some of them it's going to be really elaborate, some of them it's going to be general, but most of them have something, and usually it's specified on their website. So that's the first one. The second one is that the proposals just aren't personalized. So, you know, I admit that in my early days, I was guilty of doing this. You know, you just prepare a proposal and you just send it out to as many businesses and foundations as you can, and you just hope for the best. This method never works. It just doesn't. You'd have to be pretty lucky. So when I say personalized, basically what that means is you're at least you've done your research, you're at least sending this out and you're including the funder's name in your proposal. It's addressed to somebody. You've actually made an effort to go look at the funding criteria, just to show there's some kind of personalizing going on. Another reason that funding requests are denied are because you don't share the same interests and values. So it's really, really important that it be the right match. So of course, if you're going to send up, you know, I'll give you an example of this. Let's say you're a nonprofit who works with addiction issues. You know, maybe it's not the best idea to have a donor from a distillery or from a tobacco company, things like that. And I'm not here to tell you what to do and what not to do. This is really, I think, an individual decision that needs to be made by each organization. But like I'm saying, I think it's important for you to be clear on what your interests and your values are and make sure that they're matched properly with the funder. Another reason is the project's viability. So can the project survive on a long-term basis? Or is the amount being requested realistic? Or other funders contributing? So again, what I mean by that is, funders want to fund something that's got meat to it. Like, this can't just be some little project that doesn't, you just thought of and, let's give it a shot and see if we get funded. It doesn't work that way. It has to have some weight to it. The amount has to be realistic. So if you're asking for too much, maybe it shows that you didn't do your research. Well, same thing if you're not asking for enough. Sometimes a funder will say, well, if you're not asking for enough, they'll think, well, how is it possible to accomplish this project or to deliver this program with such little funding? So it's not realistic. Are other funders contributing? By that, what I mean is sometimes funders will only fund a project if you can demonstrate that there are other collaborators. So I think this is great in everyone's case here. It's great to be able to show who else is collaborating, and more funders are looking for this. Another reason proposals are denied is because of the fiscal year. So if it's approaching, there's a chance you may not get funded. So I'll give you an example. Let's say the fiscal year end for a business is March 31st. Well, if you're sending in a proposal that week, there's very little chance you'll get funded. Sometimes funders will have a pool of funds that are left over near, at year end, and then they'll have to disperse that funding to different organizations, but usually those are smaller amounts. So be really careful for that. Look at the fiscal year, and I'm going to show you, that information is available, and make sure that if it's approaching, maybe it's not the best time to send your proposal. Maybe you better wait for the new fiscal year to begin. Another reason is that, even if you looked at the criteria, did all your research, you matched your values, the project is viable, everything matches, sometimes there's just way too many requests, and unfortunately they have to make choices, and we just don't get funded. That doesn't mean we can't try again, but they can't fund everybody. So before you start with your research and your proposal writing, I just want to present a few questions that I'd like you to ask yourself. So first of all, is your mission compelling? So, of course it is. So make sure it's clear and easy to understand. By that, what I mean is that so many times when we work with organizations, these organizations have these big, long mission statements that are sometimes not super clear. And, I get that we can't change our mission statements, and that's not what I'm asking anybody to do, but make sure that your mission statement, that you can at least explain it in a way that everybody can understand, that it's really concise. Do you offer quality programs that meet a real need in the community? So again, of course you do. So we have to be able to show that. So give concrete evidence of that. And that relates to your successes and your measurable results. So make sure you're in a position, consider that before writing, and make sure that you're in a position to be able to show that. Other questions to ask are you targeting funders who fund organizations and service users in your sector? So, that's important too. Like, if you're just doing a broad, you're sending proposals all over the place, but sometimes, it'll be very clear on the funder's website. We only fund nonprofits that deal with the environment, or in education, or in health. So sometimes right off the bat, there's no point sending to certain funders. So make sure you look at what sector they funded. And that's the same point for region too. Sometimes they'll say we only fund nonprofits in the Montreal area. Sometimes it's province-wide, sometimes it's nationwide. So make sure you check that out. Another thing to consider is the type of funding that they support. So if they tell you we only support programs or project specific funding, well, maybe we can't really go ask for special events or for operating funds, things like that. So this is why it's really, really important to consider these things before you start sending out your proposals.
So Marie-Claude, we have a really interesting question. I think it's going to speak to the next slide. And it is, if there's too many requests and all these requests that are coming in, how can we make our projects stand out to give it that wow factor?
Exactly. That's exactly what we're going to see throughout the presentation, actually. So we're going to go through it step by step. But the most important part in all of this is targeting. There's, you know, and I'm going to repeat it, and you're going to hear me repeat the word research, but that's the key to it. And like I said, don't worry, I'm going to go through it step by step. But we have to target. We can't go at it globally, like I was saying, and just hope to just send things out and hope for the best. That just doesn't work. We have to identify who the most appropriate funders are for your project. And there's ways to do that. And that's what we're gonna look at. So targeting. How do you find the right funders? Okay. So we're going to start with one. There's different donor databases that are available that house potential funders, and usually these include government grants, businesses, and foundations. So the way that these work, what I'm going to be talking about today is mainly other than grant applications. So most of you are probably experts already in doing grant applications. So what I'm talking about today is mainly doing funding proposals to foundations and businesses. These are totally different. For those of you who've done them, you know this already. Government grants tend to be very long, very detailed. They require a lot of statistical information, supporting documents, etc. When we're talking about businesses, foundations, yes, some of them may be kind of detailed like that and require lots of information, but lots of them are also very, very simple. Some of them, it's an online form that you fill out and it can take 10, 15 minutes. So it varies greatly. So I just want to specify that because what I'm really focusing on, I know that you're all pros with doing grant applications. So what I want to focus on is mainly funding proposals to businesses and foundations. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the databases. So these databases that are available, they do house government grants too, as I mentioned, but they also have businesses and foundations. So the way that they work is you go and you enter, they have specific questions that they'll ask you. You enter all your search criteria. And then these donor databases will generate a listing of all the funders whose criteria your project matches. So some of the questions they might ask you would be like what sector you're in, what kind of funding you're looking for. Are you looking for in a specific area? Is it which province? Sometimes even which country? They'll ask you things like, are you looking for funding in the next few months, or is this a long term? So that you'll see there's a lot of different questions. It doesn't take very long, but the beauty in these databases is that they can really narrow down your search. Okay, but here's my big but. Be very, very careful, because these databases, they only provide basic donor profiles. Okay, they don't contain all the details that we need to make a funding request. So, and not all of them are kept up to date on a regular basis. So I just want, that's why I say but, because I want you to be careful. These are great tools, But it doesn't mean that once you've used this tool, that's it. You know, you'll have your listing and then you can just go out and send your funding request. That's not how this works. So this is the starting point. So I just want everybody to be really, really clear on that. So I just want to mention the one that I use at Espace Idée that I'm a member of is Imagine Canada's Grant Connect, okay? And you know, I'm not getting paid by Grant Connect to say this, and I'm not necessarily advocating one database over the other. I'm just talking about this one because this is the one that I've always used and the one that I'm most familiar with, and I really do think it's great. So right now, what I encourage you to do is Imagine Canada is doing this great thing where you can actually get the version for free. So usually it does have a cost to access these databases. Usually public libraries will sometimes have versions of this. So if you go to the public library, you can do a search. Right now, because the public libraries are closed, Imagine Canada is offering the opportunity to sign up and to get the community edition free of charge. But it says until April 8th, which is today. And they did write on their website that they may extend this period depending on how the situation evolves. So I went to have a look on their website this morning to see if they changed the date. It wasn't changed yet. I'm pretty certain it will. So keep your eyes open because Imagine is doing all these great things to support nonprofits during COVID-19. So I would not be surprised at all if they did extend it. But go have a look. You at least have until today, at the end of today. I know that doesn't give you much time. And like I said, hopefully they extend it. But what a great, great opportunity. So this is the page that you'll get to. All you have to do is click on sign up for the community edition. Now, my only other but that I'm going to put in here is that this is, when you sign up, you have to give your charitable registration number. So, oh, I saw the next question pop up. Did you want to ask, Catherine?
Sure. So speaking specifically to this question of charitable foundation, for those who are in the room with us today, does your school or your school board have a charitable foundation? We know that this is not the case for everyone. I could think of at least two that, that do have it. So the school has an additional charitable foundation with that number. And some that don't know, that's a great question to go back to your principal and ask them. And if you don't, possibly a partner in the community has a charitable foundation. So that's definitely someone that you can reach out to see if you might want to look at this database together.
Yeah, that's a great point, Catherine, because I have to be honest with everybody here and say that if you're looking for foundation funding, usually foundations will give to charities. So you have to have a charitable registration number. So this database works the same way. In order to sign up, you're going to have to give your charitable registration number. And the reason for that is because this database was really set up for charities, and the funders usually give to charities. But I think what Catherine just mentioned is a great point. I mean, a lot of you have great collaborations. So if you have partners that you can collaborate with, that's perfect. So like I said, that's for the databases. There's others, but this is the one that I'm used to. And like I said, this is the one that you can access for free at the moment. So I encourage you to go have a look at that. So research. So if, let's say, like I said, you have the database, which is great. It's going to pop out a list. It's going to save you lots of time. But it doesn't end there. And let's say you don't use the database. Let's say you're not a registered charity, and let's say you can't use the database. Well, research. I can't emphasize that enough. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but trust me, putting in the effort at the beginning on your research is going to save you so much time in the long run, and it's going to guarantee, well, I shouldn't say guarantee, it's going to increase your chances of getting that funding. So after, let's say you did use the database and you do have a list, well, afterwards, always make sure you review the funder's website, okay? So the website will usually have most of the information that you need. So they'll usually talk about what their interests in, and this is whether it's a foundation or a business, okay? So they'll talk about what their interests in philanthropy and what their funding criteria are. They'll usually mention their investment priorities. You'll find their annual reports and names of board members and management. And the reason I say annual reports and names of board members and management, the reason that's important is, first of all, when you just go on their website, we don't always see who are the other nonprofits that they supported. However, if you go into their annual report, a lot of times when businesses do their annual reports and they have to report back to their investors, usually they may not name all of the nonprofits that they supported during the past year, but they'll give some profiles of a few nonprofits that they supported. So usually that gives us a good idea of who they're funding, what type of projects they're funding. For the names of board members and management, again, the reason that's important is sometimes we can sort of make links with, is there board members that you know at the foundation or in the business, or, are there some of your own board members or trustees or in your management? Is there anybody, are there connections that we can sort of take advantage of and make phone calls and get more information? So it's important to look at that. It may not give you anything, and probably the majority of the time it won't, but if there's that one connection or that one person that you know there that can help you out a little bit, well, why not? You have to make a link between the funder and your school or your project to determine if it's a good match, okay? So you have to look at the values and the mission. You have to look at who's their target audience or who's their clientele. You have to look at their interests, or what kind of problems is this company or the foundation, what are they trying to solve? Does it match with yours? Who are their team members? So that sort of goes back to my last point on the last slide. If you can make connections between some of the people, then take advantage of that. And still more research. So after you've looked at the funder's website, here are other sources of information that you can consider. I'm not necessarily advocating that you go through all of these for every single funder. If you can find all the information you need on their website, that's great. If you can't, here are other sources of information that I'm proposing. So there are other donor databases, not just the one that I mentioned, okay? You can also consider going on your Chamber of Commerce website. So usually your local Chamber of Commerce will have all of the businesses that are members in your area, and that can be a good starting point, because that's happened sometimes where, we haven't necessarily thought of all the businesses that could potentially support our programs. So, that's a good way to go at it too. You can look at industrial sector lists. So every area, depending on which region you're in, for their industrial sector, and usually it's sometimes it can be linked with the Chamber of Commerce too, but they'll usually have a listing of all the businesses in their industrial sector. And so these are great lists too, because it can sort of open your eyes up to all these other businesses that you never thought maybe you could approach. You can also look at other organizations with a mission similar to yours. So I know this kind of seems like it's cheating a little bit, but I have to be honest with you. When I started out in the area, that's one of the first things we did. It was when I started, and it was for a university foundation, and we would go look at the other colleges, technical schools, universities, and who were they receiving funding for, which businesses, which foundations, and then if those funders are supporting other organizations with a mission similar to yours, well, there's a pretty good chance that they would probably support you as well. So the point there is not to compete and step on each other's toes, but I think it's a good idea to go see and check it out and see who are the other organizations similar to yours also getting funding. like I said there, make sure to look at not just websites, but annual reports. So I talked a little bit about on a few previous slides about the business annual reports or the foundation annual reports, but go look at the organization, the nonprofit annual reports, because a lot of them will usually put listings of who they receive donations or support from. So that's a good tool to use to go get a few ideas. With the Canada Revenue Agency, that one, the only reason I put that is because, you know, you can, any kind of foundation, if it's, you know, if it's a foundation, automatically they're going to be on the Canada Revenue Agency site. So you can go get information about foundations there. You just type in, go under, it's under Canada Revenue Agency, you have to go under the charity section, and there's a search. You just type in the foundation and you'll get information about foundations there. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Charity Village. I love, love, love Charity Village. They've been around since forever. Even when I started more than 20 years ago, they were around. And Charity Village is a great resource for anything nonprofit. Absolutely anything you're looking for, they have awesome resources. And on Charity Village, they do have a listing of foundations and businesses. It's national, so it's all over Canada, so it's big, I admit, and it's not a search database. So that's the only thing. It's great because they do have businesses and foundations listed there, and I mean businesses and foundations that give funding, but keep in mind that you can't do a search. You're going to have to go through, so it can be a little bit more time consuming, but still, it's a great resource. You can find more information if you haven't found it elsewhere. Your municipal library. So like I mentioned, Imagine Canada, the donor database, the Grant Connect, is usually available in municipal libraries. If it's not, a lot of municipal libraries, they subscribe to other types of donor databases. So you can consider that. Just to keep in mind again, though, that sometimes the process can be a little bit more time consuming. Sometimes it's in a catalog that you have to like manually go through and then take notes or make photocopies. But again, it's a resource that's there for you to use. I put Registraire des entreprises du Québec, and I use this a lot. And how I use it is that sometimes when you go and do your research, whether it's donor databases, websites, any of the tools I mentioned already, you can't find any names, any representatives, any contact information. So, and sometimes they do it on purpose because they don't want to be overwhelmed by people calling and writing, etc. But if you go on the Registraire des entreprises and you can type in the foundation or the business, you'll at least get some contact information. Now, it's not going to be everybody. It's usually, you have like the presidents, vice presidents, the general director, executive director, things like that. But at least it gives you a contact, because I'm going to talk about this later, but this relates back to when I was talking about personalizing. And one of the reasons that proposals are denied is because they're not personalized. If you send a funding request to somebody and there's no name on it, it's not personalized, it's, well, you know, why would somebody look at it? So you have to try and personalize as much as possible. And one of the ways you can do that is by addressing to an actual person if you can. So if you don't have a name, try Registraire des entreprises du Québec. And of course, Google research. So great old Google, you know, we can pretty much find anything, but I know it's going to be, it's never ending, the search. So that's why I prefer you start with some of those other tools. And then, you know, you can do Google research, but you're going to have to narrow it down because you're going to get overwhelmed by so much information. Okay, so content development. So I just want to start by saying, you know, there's nothing wrong with calling your potential funders to ask them questions if thinking about sending a request. Now, some of them will specifically say on their website, in their criteria, don't call us. So if they say it, then don't do it. But a lot of them don't mention that. So if they don't mention it, there's nothing wrong with calling or even emailing them to ask questions. Or sometimes it's just to say, hey, we'd like to submit a funding proposal. We think this could be a good match, and however you want to frame that. This could save you a lot of time, because right away the funder can confirm, like, is this a good idea for you to be sending them a funding proposal? Is the timing right? So if you can do it, do it. And this is a great way to develop a relationship with your funding proposals. And this is a good way to stand out in the pile. So remember when I gave the reasons at the beginning why proposals get denied? And you remember the last point I said, well, sometimes you could have did all the right things and fulfilled all the criteria, but sometimes there's just too many and they have to reject them. Well, if you call them and if you developed a relationship with them and if you're top of mind for them and they're aware of you and their name rings a bell, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to get passed to the next stage. So if you can call them and develop that relationship, by all means, do it. Don't hesitate. Okay, so before you start writing, here's a few points I want you to keep in mind. As some of you know, it can take weeks, sometimes even months to get a decision. There's a lot of times we work with nonprofits and, they're like, well, why is it taking so long? It's, I sent it last week or 2 weeks ago and I still didn't get any news. Well, it can take weeks. I've seen some funders take more than 6 months sometimes to make a decision. So that's why you really have to give yourself lots of time. And if your project is for a specific project or you need it for a precise point in time, for this summer or whatever, this fall, make sure that you start ahead of time and you give yourself a lot of time. Always review the funder's criteria and instructions if they exist. So I can't emphasize that enough. Always include a presentation letter that summarizes the request. So, unless they specifically in their criteria, they say we only want you to send this, then fine, respect that. If they don't say it, I always prefer that someone send a presentation letter along with their proposal. And the presentation letter has to summarize your request. So don't go into big details, but be really to the point, make it catchy, make it stand out. And that makes a difference too. And this is a good way to personalize, because in a funding proposal, I get that it's hard to personalize sometimes, but in a presentation letter, there's no reason why you can't personalize by addressing the letter to a specific person. Dear Mr. or Ms. So-and-so, we're seeking the support of Bell Canada. Like, this is the ideal place where you can go and personalize your request. Be very careful with acronyms, abbreviations, references, technical terms, especially in your case. I know we have the CLCs and you have a lot of acronyms. Be really careful with that, because we sometimes, and I'm guilty of that too, we're so wrapped up in our world and we don't realize that people on the outside may not follow what we're talking about. So be really careful. Make sure that you use full descriptors, that you use complete names, at least the first times, and then put it in brackets, the acronym, for afterwards if you want to start using them. But just be really careful. And just on the side, I want to point out, this is such a big problem for some funders that some of them will even say in their criteria, they'll say this, like, watch for acronyms, or please be aware of acronyms, and use complete references. So that's how big a problem it can be for them sometimes. Make sure your request isn't too long and that you're not including unnecessary information. So, sometimes I think we have the tendency to just put in everything that we want, so many things, because we just don't want to forget something, and we want to tell them how good we are and all our services and, all the good that we do, which is great. But keep in mind, remember at the beginning, you know, all those funding proposals that those funders are getting, they have to go through all of that. So you can be sure that if they're presented, you know, with a 50-page proposal, that makes it pretty tempting to pass it and put it in the reject pile. So make sure that you're sticking to what they specifically request. Okay, so content development, what to include. So let's say that your funder doesn't mention any funding criteria. So then you kind of wonder, okay, well, what do I include then? And you're going to find this, especially with foundations. A lot of foundations will say, we don't have any funding criteria because we want to respect the originality and uniqueness of every nonprofit organization. You'll see that. So if that's the case, here is kind of a template of some of the things that you could include in your funding proposal. Now, this is pretty basic. So I'm going to go into detail with each of these, okay? So first, brief history, mission, vision, values, presentation of the need, the problem, or the challenge that you're addressing, presentation of your objectives, your action plan, and what impact you have, your project cost or budget, your specific request, including the amount requested, what this amount is going to help you accomplish, and possibly supporting documentation. So we're going to go through this. So on the bottom here, you see I put be creative with your titles. Okay, so let me just first say this. If your funder has specific criteria, let's say it's a list like this, okay, and they say brief history, presentation. If they're very clear on what the funding criteria are, use these as your titles and subtitles. That way, it's much easier for the funder to go and find what they're looking for. If the funder doesn't have the funding criteria and they kind of want you to they want to respect your originality and uniqueness, like some of them will say, then you can be creative with some of your titles. You don't have to go exactly with what I put here. You know, use what speaks to you. Okay, so brief history, mission, vision, and values. So first of all, be concise. So when I talk about brief history, you know, we worked with an organization and they've been around for 30 years. And at first it was almost like a book, their history. And it's super interesting and it's amazing what they've done. But, you know, a brief history means exactly that. It's a brief history. We don't need to know all the details. It's not, yes, it's important to a funder, but not, you know, you have to be brief. Make sure your mission is well understood. So this goes back to what I said at the beginning. We all have a mission statement, but sometimes mission statements are kind of big and long and convoluted, and you know, sometimes they're not always easy to understand. So make sure if you put your mission statement, make sure afterwards in a sentence you can explain it in real words in an easy way to understand. With your vision and values, you want to find a link between the funder's vision, values, and yours, okay? So for example, you can say something as straight out as the values of organization X align perfectly with those of business X, which are, and then you're going to state these. And I'm going to give you some examples here, okay? So I looked at the nonprofit Share the Warmth, okay? I'm not going to read word for word their mission, their vision, and their values, okay? But I'm going to come back to this slide. I'm just going to show you, and then I'm going to compare with the next one, which is Fondation Germain Bombardier. I'm just going to pop out their mission, vision, objectives, okay? So I'm not going to read all of that. You're going to get the slides. You're going to be able to go through it. But the point I just want to make is, first of all, if you go into the mission of each one, well, each of them sort of makes reference to, you know, in Bombardier, they talk about the humanitarian work of Joseph Armand Bombardier. If you go to Share the Warmth, of course they have a humanitarian mission. If you go into vision, Bombardier talks about dreaming of a better world. About Share the Warmth talks about reaching, you know, I can go back. Sorry, this is going to be, I probably didn't set this up exactly the right way, but Share the Word talks about reaching their full potential and people achieving their dreams. So you can go and make connections between these. But Viability talks about favoring initiatives that encourage the development of knowledge. Share the Warmth talks about development of success of children and youth and employment and job readiness programs. So you can easily go make connections between those. In values, Bombardier talks about, they say we value building on strengths and taking into account unique circumstances. Well, Share the Warmth talks about openness, inclusion, respect. So I think you get where I'm going with this. You have to make the connection between your funder and your organization. And you can do this, pretty easily by looking at mission, vision, values. If there are no matches, well, maybe that it isn't such a good match for you then. So maybe it's, you should concentrate on another foundation or another business. Unless the funder is so general and they fund absolutely everything and anything, but that's pretty rare. It's really important to do this exercise and to take the time to really go and find what is similar between you, your organization, and your funder.
What's the difference between a vision and a mission?
Well, usually any organization their mission is the actual work that they do on a day-to-day basis. Vision usually speaks to where they want to go, what's their overall vision. So it's usually a more global terms.
Thank you.
No problem. So I'll keep going, but yeah, if you have any questions as we go along, keep sending those along. The second thing, okay, the presentation of your need, problem, challenge. So of course, I don't want to be negative here, but obviously if we exist, it's because we're addressing a certain need. So make sure you present the problem or the need, whichever language your organization uses, but present that and how you're addressing it in the community. Use statistics and make sure you use credible source of information. So at the end, use your sources, cite your sources. Don't just say, well, 50% of our population, really use credible sources and make sure you cite your information. Emphasize real situations and stories within your organization to communicate your mission and your messages. So you can use things like storytelling or testimonials that really speak to the problems that you're addressing and how you address your mission. And if you can, use photos. So with permission, of course, like I said. So this is a big difference here with when you're doing grant applications. Grant applications are so straightforward and you really have to follow to a T. With proposals to foundations and businesses, you can be a little bit more creative. You can use color, you can use images, you can, we're going to come back to that point a bit later on, but using photos can just speak volumes. And I think you all know that, it gets kind of boring to read a bunch of text when you can put in a picture that you can associate, especially if you're talking about a real situation in your organization. It's so much more interesting to have pictures in there. And here I think we were gonna stop and see if there's anybody who wanted to provide an example of a specific problem that your school or program is addressing in the community.
We've been working certainly since COVID, feeding our families, but we started a breakfast program it ended up starting only in January, but our focus, because we have, living in the Laurentians, there's a lot of needy families that are dispersed all around. So, but we focused a lot on nutrition. And now with COVID, we've spread out to giving baskets of food and supplies to families. But that is one of our focuses is feeding our children when they get to school, for all the reasons that we know that makes them focus better. So that's one of our focuses we have here at St. Agatha Academy CLC is feeding our vulnerable families.
Great. Good job. And I think that's a real, Chantal, I think that's an excellent point you're making too, by bringing up the specific circumstances that we're under right now. There's actually a lot of emergency funds that are being created at the moment, specific to COVID-19, especially if you're some of the essential services. And so if you can present your issue, your need, or your problem, you know, right now with some of these emergency funds being created, this is a great opportunity to go and do that.
There's one more example that Lynn would like to share.
Hi, this is basically, it's a continuation of what Chantal said. I find in our community, a lot of people, it's not necessarily that they've stopped working, it's they can't start working because of this situation. And we picked up a box for one of our local residents from the local food bank, and there was literally nothing in it because they depend on the restaurants that are closed, these different stores. So we've started between the CLD, the school, and different community groups, we've started our own food bank with the same idea to help those that we, not necessarily that, as I said, have lost their jobs, they can't start their jobs. So this is what we're trying to address right now, and it's going really well. We've had so much donations from the community, from outside of the community, actually, from, you know, even outside of the region. So we're really positive about that. At least we know we're able to provide food, not just for our students' families, but for community members also.
Yeah, and one of the questions that I'm thinking for some of you, particularly in the regions, the companies that might still be working right now, if they're deemed essential services, and even looking a little bit further down the line, you know, in some areas, I know that there is like 1 or 2 industries. It's the main business in the area. So a lot of people already work there. You know, it might be in these businesses' best interest to perhaps donate or fund programs that you offer through the CLCs or through other partnering organizations. So just thinking about that as well, how can the industries that currently exist, the businesses, maybe it's some of the smaller businesses.
Yeah, that's a great point, Catherine. That speaks to the last point, you know, about making that match between the businesses out there in your community and the specific needs that you can address that will tie into what that business is trying to achieve in the community as well. Okay, so number 3 is presenting your objectives, your action plan, and your impact. Okay, so be very, very specific in what it is that you want to accomplish. What is it that you're trying to do, and how are you going to meet your objectives? So make sure you state that. Talk about the impact of financial support and donations received. What does that do? What does that funding do for you? So for some of you who took part in the last webinar where we talked about impact reporting, you can use some of those tricks that we talked about. So using quantitative and quantitative data to demonstrate what is the impact of your organization in meeting those needs. This next point, really important. Don't send a wish list of all the projects you'd like funded. So this is something that we see a lot. So sometimes nonprofits will send just, well, like I said here, a wish list of everything they would like funded. So pick something and target it to that funder. So send your proposal for specific programs and projects. So sometimes, and this is really an exception, sometimes, for example, let's say a nonprofit organization has a major fundraising campaign, a capital campaign underway, where they're looking at funding for many, many different things. Sometimes they'll develop these kind of case statements where they state all of their various needs. That's different. That's not what I'm talking about here. These are funding proposals, and these should be as specific and as targeted as possible, and that includes your projects. So don't send out a whole bunch of projects that you would like funded and ask your funder to pick one. You know, unless they specifically state that that's what they want you to do, but I would be very surprised. I've never seen that before. your project cost and budget. Okay, so make sure your numbers are precise and that they line up with your budget. So again, sometimes, we don't take the time to look at that, so sometimes we may want to ask for a certain amount, but then when, if the funder goes into the budget, somehow it doesn't quite match up. So make sure that those align. You can list confirmed and unconfirmed funding for the project to date. So this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that a lot of funders, they look for collaborators. So they want to make sure that they're not the only ones investing money in this project. So they want to see who else is involved, or who else have you asked. So you can put it, even if it's not confirmed, you can state what your unconfirmed funding is. That's not a problem. And don't forget to include in-kind donations. That's really, really important, especially when we're talking about collaboration. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have space that you can borrow, or equipment that you can borrow. Well, there's a value to that. And if you didn't have it, somebody lend you that space or lend you that equipment, well, you would have to rent it, or you would have to buy it, or whatever. And that's a cost, that's an expense. So if you can save that expense, well, that's great. That's work that you did to get that. So make sure that you include it in your budget. So I think that funders really appreciate that. If they can see that you're making the effort to go and reduce your expenses, or to go and find support, whichever way you can, including through in-kind donations, they want to see that. Be careful with your messaging, okay? So it's, we have to be careful. We don't ever want to say something like, well, we don't have enough money to buy such and such equipment. I know that's the case, but use a different angle, and that makes all the difference. You want to present an opportunity to contribute, okay? That inspires a lot more confidence than saying we don't have the money, because let's face it, who wants to associate themselves with something that may not be working so well? Because that's kind of the message that we're sending. So be really, really careful with what angle you're using. You want to inspire confidence. Keep in mind that some foundations will only fund projects if the CLC or partner is in a position to demonstrate funding support from other sources. So I talked about that too. Not only is it a good thing to show that you're collaborating with other partners, and you should really include those in your funding proposal, but you'll see that sometimes you have to. It's an obligation. For some foundations, they won't fund you unless you can say that you collaborate specifically with other partners. Okay, so the specific request, the amount requested, okay? So now we're getting into specifics, okay? So before we were talking on a more global level about what it is that we want, the need we're addressing, but here we're talking about a specific amount that we're requesting. So be careful not to ask for an excessive nor an insufficient amount. So if you ask for an excessive amount, obviously you're going to get shoved to the reject pile. Sometimes if you don't have enough, the funder is going to say, again, like I was saying at the beginning, they're going to wonder, well, how can they possibly deliver that program or that project with that kind of funding? It just doesn't add up. So again, be really, really careful. This is where your research makes a difference. And it brings me back to a point with the Imagine Canada Grant Connect database. I didn't mention this earlier, and I don't know how I forgot this, but one of the great things about that database is you can actually go see what these foundations and businesses, who they gave to, and for which program, and what the amount was. So that is such a wonderful resource, because sometimes we're not sure what amount to ask for. It's hard. So if you go into that database, you will see exactly what the funder gave, what amount they gave, and that can sort of help position you. It'll give you a good idea, in terms of deciding, am I asking for too much? Am I not asking for enough? You can, in the database, you can also do a search by, let's say you have a specific organization, a specific nonprofit, and you want to go see what they received. You can do a search by nonprofit and enter the name of the nonprofit, and it'll give you a list of all the funders that gave money to them and what amount. So things like that are little tricks that'll help you determine what amount you should be asking for, because obviously your amount should be based on your specific project. But sometimes, you know, our budgets aren't final. Sometimes we don't necessarily know what all those expenses are going to be. So just do your research and be careful with the amount you're asking for. State the specific. So I get this question a lot, is should we be asking for a specific amount? Yes, as much as possible, you should always be asking for a specific amount. So you should be sending out a proposal saying, we are requesting a donation from the RBC Foundation. No, that doesn't work. You need to say what amount you're requesting and be specific, you know, in terms of what that's for. If the funder accepts multi-year pledges or commitments, you should, especially if you have a project or a program that's going to be carried out on a long-term basis over several years, you should definitely jump on that opportunity and ask for multi-year pledges. So you can ask in your proposal, for example, we're requesting a commitment of $50,000 over the next 5 years. So $10,000 per year for 5 years. So if the funder specifically says that they allow those kind of partnerships or commitments, by all means, take advantage of it. Like I said, especially if your program or project is multi-year. If it's not a multi-year project, then don't do it, you know, because you can't back yourself up. But if it is, definitely take advantage of this. What is the amount used for? So once you've stated your amount, be specific. Don't just say we're requesting $50,000 over the next 5 years. Say what that's going to be used for. So this amount will pay for an after-school program for 30 kids for 10 months, for example, or it'll equip our computer lab with 20 iPads so we can offer training to 50 seniors over the next year, you know, whatever. I'm just using any example, but you have to use numbers and you have to use concrete information like that to say exactly what the amount used for is going to cover. If you're requesting funding for operating costs, and I don't think that's the case for most people here, but I'm just going to mention it, talk about the funding allowing you to pursue your mission. Okay, so when we're asking funding for operating costs, we don't say things like we're asking for $50,000 to cover the salary of, you know, and whatever. You want to talk about your mission. We're asking for this money to pursue our mission of offering services to the community. Supporting documentation. So a lot of times these funders are going to ask for additional information that they want you to include with your proposal. Okay, so some examples of what these might be. And I know that doesn't apply to all of you, but I just want you to keep this in mind that it is a possibility that they may ask for a very detailed project budget. They may ask for your most recent financial statements in some cases, and this applies to for those of you who have charities and have charitable registration numbers. They may ask for your financial statements. They're going to ask for your most recent annual report. They may ask for a listing of your partner organizations or who you collaborate with. Although I think you should automatically include that in there because I think that's a bonus. Members of the board or trustees, in some cases, again, that would apply probably more to anybody who has a charitable registration number and who has a board of directors. Make sure you always include your contact information. I know that sounds so obvious, but sometimes we just don't think of that and we don't put the specific name of somebody that they can contact for more information. Sometimes they may ask for any kind of brochures or communication material you have or other. So just be prepared that these are some of the documents they may potentially ask for. So I wanted to include a little section about recognition and visibility plans, because sometimes funders may ask you to include that in your proposal. Not always, and I would have to tell you the majority don't, okay? So it's pretty rare they'll ask you this, but they may. So I think it's really, really important, and I can't emphasize this enough, and that's why I put it in red, because I really want you to remember this. There is a difference between a sponsorship and a donation, and you have to be very, very careful with the Canada Revenue Agency when you're doing this, because a sponsorship equals marketing equals visibility. A donation equals a gift equals acknowledgement or recognition, okay? So in other words, if somebody is doing a sponsorship, that's usually considered marketing, because they're getting visibility in return. They're getting publicity in return for the sponsorship. So usually when a funder gives sponsorship dollars, that doesn't come out of a donation budget. That money comes usually from a marketing budget, okay? This is like advertising for them. And no charitable receipt can be issued for a sponsorship. Never, ever, ever. Okay, so one way to distinguish a sponsorship, a sure way to distinguish it, is as soon as you start seeing logos plastered all over the place, or when you start seeing levels, for example, a gold, silver, bronze level, where you distinguish between your different sponsorships, automatically it becomes marketing, it becomes advertising, and you cannot issue a tax receipt for that. A donation is when it's philanthropic. Somebody makes a gift with nothing expected in return. So in this case, we can give a tax receipt. And we can do an acknowledgement, we can do a recognition, but we just can't go and plaster their logos all over the place and give them advertising and banners and all sorts of things like that, because Canada Revenue Agency will consider that advertising. So it's important to distinguish between the two. Now, I'm not doing this to scare you. Often when I do this, or I have nonprofits, I say, oh my goodness, like I made a mistake then. I treated some as sponsorships and I gave them a receipt. And I'm not saying this to scare you. I don't think the CRA is going to drop by and remove your charitable registration status. They may just give a warning, but it's just important to be aware of this. If you've got a donation and you gave a receipt and you're doing some basic recognition, a small logo here, you're not differentiating between all your supporters, that's not a problem. They're not going to go after things like that. Where they do start getting concerned is as soon as you start differentiating between levels of giving, that becomes sponsorship. So just be really, really careful when just to distinguish between the two. So if for some reason you have funders that ask for recognition or visibility plans, make sure that you're clear on what it is. Are you going to present a sponsorship opportunity, or are you presenting a donation opportunity? So you have to develop, if they ask for it, you're going to have to develop a plan or a template, a table for each level and form of visibility recognition. So I'm sure you've seen these before. These are like grids. They're tables where, you'll have like just for donations from $20 to $50, you get this. For donations of $50 to $100, you get this, and so on. And it's the same thing for a sponsorship. So you can always develop a grid. If you want to look at examples, just type in Google sponsorship plan, visibility plan, you'll get tons of examples. When you develop this tool, it's going to serve as your guide to make sure you're consistent and fair with everybody, because the last thing you want to start doing is, well, okay, if, we gave this sponsor such and such recognition or visibility, and, you gave somebody else more. So you have to make sure you have a level of consistency and fairness with all your supporters. Sometimes you have to be a little flexible, and that's okay. So I'll just give you an example of that. in one place, in a hospice where I worked, we had in the lobby, we had a tree. And every time somebody gave a donation of $5,000 and more, they got a heart that we would put, it was a little plaque that we would put on the tree, and it was just their name. Everybody had, it was the same size, so it wasn't a sponsorship, it was truly a donation, but it was for gifts of $5,000 and more. Well, it happened many times where, you know, donors would say, or families would say, or even patients would say, you know, I don't have the $5,000 right off the bat. Can I do it over, you know, X number of years? Or is it okay if when, you know, when my will passes through and I made a donation, you know, it's coming, but I just don't have it right now? Well, of course we're going to be flexible. Of course we're going to accept that and put the name on the tree. So that's okay. You have to sometimes remain flexible. Always verify with your sponsors and donors beforehand. So don't assume that your donors or your sponsor, well, not your sponsors, that you know, your sponsors want, of course they're going to want visibility, but your donors, this applies more to them. Don't assume that they want their name everywhere. We often see donor lists. You know, you always have to check with them beforehand. So if they do, that's fine. If somebody does it, if somebody wants to be anonymous, then at least you're aware of that and you haven't made the error of putting their name somewhere. Your recognition for donors, these are just a few examples. You know, by no means is this, you know, there's so many more things you can do. You can be original. We have donor walls, plaques, certificates, special mentions, recognition events, naming opportunities. You can engage the donor with your organization. You can, you know, invite them to any conferences or workshops or training that you present. You can invite them to come visit your site. You can share testimonials with them. You can do a press release. There's exceptions here. I'm going to come back to them. You can do annual report profiles. So in your annual report, put a profile on one of your donors and their reasons for getting involved with you. You can create interactions with your service, between your service users and your donors. You can do video thank yous with staff or volunteers saying a thank you. So just be careful. The reason I say there's exceptions is that, for example, a press release. You're not going to start doing a press release for all your donors. Obviously, it's if there's a significant amount, there's a reason for it. And again, it goes back to the distinguishing between sponsors and donors. You want to be careful here that you're not doing publicity. It's not advertising. It has to be recognition. So just be careful. If you're ever unsure, you can always call Canada Revenue Agency, and they're great. They're going to help you out. You don't wait on the phone very long. And now you may because of everything that's going on, but usually they're very helpful.
Something very important that I wanted to mention is please always double check with your school and your school board to see what the rules and regulations are in place. So sometimes there's, you know, some loopholes if you go through another foundation and, you know, the foundation is paying for something and you're using those funds, but please double check to make sure what the rules and regulations are for your school and for your school board before even approaching the funders or considering something like specifically about sponsorship.
Yeah, great point. For sure. Great point. I'm not going to go through the visibility for sponsors. You have it there. You're going to get it with the presentation. The only thing I want to say real quick is that, you know, for your sponsors, you can offer some of the same things you provide to your donors, but just remember, for a sponsor, we're talking about more visibility, more like advertising. However, the key here is to remember they cannot by any means be issued a charitable tax receipt for their support. In visuals, I just want to say, I mentioned it quick, when you're doing grants, you have to be straightforward. I know you can't get too creative. When you're doing proposals to foundations and businesses, you do have a little bit more flexibility and latitude to get a little bit more creative, but don't go overboard, okay? Use a font that's not too small, easy to read. Use titles and subtitles. That way it's easier for funders to find and match what their funding criteria are. Always page numbers, highlight, underline, and points, and avoid text-heavy pages. Always do follow-ups unless they specifically say not to call them, okay? If they don't say that, there's no reason why you can't be doing follow-ups. So keep in mind, it can take some time to get an answer, but if they say you should get an answer in 6 to 8 weeks and it's been 2 months and you haven't received an answer, by all means, call them, write an email, just to ask them, have decisions been made, okay? It's important to do that. If your request was denied, you can contact them to discuss and let them know that you'd like to resubmit at a future day and you'd like to better understand how you can improve your request. There's nothing wrong with that, and I think most of them would be willing to do that. And most of it's important to communicate to build those relationships. So this is a great way to do it. Reports, we talked about this real fast for those who did the last webinar. Some of them will specifically state that you're going to have to send reports, and they'll tell you what those reporting requirements are. Even if they don't tell you to send your reports, I think it's always a good idea to report back to them, and that's just going to increase your chances of getting future funding, and it's a great way to develop relationships. So again, use qualitative and quantitative data to demonstrate how the funding was used and what the impact that the funding had. Get testimonials from your service users, your volunteers, your staff, and you can use that to demonstrate impact as well. Consider inviting your funders for a visit, and you can give them the report in person. So there's no better way to see directly the work that you do than by inviting them to see your programs and your projects. So these are all ways that you want to build your relationships with them. And again, it's going to demonstrate your accountability, your transparency, and increase your chances of getting additional funding down the road.
The question around mission and vision statements has come up.
If you don't have a vision, that's okay. The idea behind that, just we'll keep it really, really simple here. The idea, what I want you guys to do is to match what the values of your organization, your CLC, your project, whichever, to the funder. So, you know, if you don't have, you know, the specific mission, vision, values, that's okay. But you have to at least go and match what you're doing with what the foundation or what the business is doing. So that's really the idea behind that.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Marie-Claude.
Thank you, everybody. I really